Okay, so the numbers seem to have leveled off there in terms of coming in. I'm sure people will join us as the event continues, but I'm delighted to welcome you to the fifth session of this year's Dublin Economics Workshop Annual Policy Conference, which once again is kindly sponsored by the Dublin Chamber of Commerce. So thank you very much to them for enabling us to continue coming to you during the pandemic. Even if we're not in Wexford, we are here in various places across Ireland and Britain today, the panel. So today's session is looking at the issue of the impact of school closures during the pandemic and how policy should respond. It's a hugely important issue, I think, with potentially lifelong consequences for those affected. So I'm delighted to be joined by an expert panel. We have with us, and speaking first will be Professor Emer Smyth, a research professor at the Economic and Social Research Institute, ESRI, and co-principal investigator of Growing Up in Ireland. She's going to speak first and will be followed by Dr. Chzhen, assistant professor at the Department of Sociology in Trinity College Dublin, who's worked previously at the UNICEF in Osantini Research Centre in Florence and the University of Oxford. And then finally, we have Luke Sibieta, research fellow at both the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the Education Policy Institute, as well as director of the eponymous Sibieta Economics of Education. So thank you to all those speakers for joining us today. I'm sure it's going to be a great discussion. And I'll hand you over now, without further ado, to Emer Smyth, who's going to kick us off talking about some of her research on this important topic. So thanks very much.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you can see it. Barra, give me a shout if there's any problems. So I'm going to give a kind of quite an overview piece drawing on two studies. The first was a study I completed with Merrick Darmody and Helen Russell in the first lockdown. And that was really an overview of emerging international and Irish research on the impact of the pandemic on children and young people. And I'm also going to talk about some summary findings from a COVID-specific survey of 12-year-olds and their parents that was conducted as part of the Growing Up in Ireland study, and that was carried out in December 2020. Now, much of the research in the first lockdown in particular was based on online convenience samples. These were quick and easy to do, but there was a kind of good deal of selective response. So they couldn't be taken as representative of the broader population. So the evidence base in the first few months of the pandemic was quite variable. There were also some useful rapid reviews based on pre-COVID studies of issues like quarantine, and there were some interesting qualitative studies on specific groups of children, young people, and adults. In our first overview report, we placed greater weight on those studies that were based on representative samples, such as the work the CSO did on the social impact of COVID. They did a series of surveys, which I'll mention again later. However, it became clear that most of the research in Ireland, at any rate, involved adults talking about children and young people, rather than children and young people being asked about their own experiences. And I know Kat's work will fill in the gap there from the child perspective. And this was really a motivation for doing a COVID-specific survey of the Growing Up in Ireland cohort. So none of this will be very new to you. Very quickly, it became clear that international research was highlighting inequalities in engagement in and support for home learning as children and young people move to remote learning. An ESRI study carried out by colleagues in the first lockdown surveyed school principals, and they found that over 70% said there had been a significant decline in student participation and engagement during that lockdown. And obviously, the impact on different kinds of learning was differential. So the kind of group work and practical work that young people tend to find most engaging was the most strongly affected. Now, DESH schools, for those outside the jurisdiction, this is a support scheme which provides additional resources and supports to schools serving more socioeconomically disadvantaged populations. And these schools reported much lower levels of engagement in remote learning than other schools, and that they reported that their students had more problems with adequate broadband access and with having an adequate number of devices to work on. There was also a wide digital divide found by that ESRI study by the level of disadvantage at the area level. So it wasn't just individual social background, but there was a kind of a regional or local dimension, including fewer online classes for those in more disadvantaged areas. Now, some of the CSO work, which focused on parent perspective, but is nonetheless useful, showed a contrast between the first and second closure periods. In the first period, a very significant minority of parents reported a major or moderate negative effect on their children's learning and on their social development. And at that stage, the time reported by parents on home learning was quite modest. For primary school children, 2/3 were reporting 2 hours or less a day. For second level, that was still 4 and 10. Now, by the second closure period, there had been some anecdotal evidence that schools had been more organized or were, engaged in a bit less firefighting than the first time around. Parents still reported negative effects on their children's outcomes, but the time on home learning increased markedly between that August survey, which related to kind of learning in May and June, and February of this year. There was also kind of a lack of systematic information on students with special educational needs, but emerging qualitative information showed that remote learning was particularly challenging for these groups, especially those that had behavioral, attention, or intellectual difficulties. Linked to the broader context, it's important to see learning embedded in those broader supports. Referrals weren't happening because schools were closed, and therapy appointments were often cancelled. And the qualitative research that was conducted indicated that parents felt they lacked suitable educational materials, especially adapted for children with Chzhen. There was really very little information about the experience of migrant children in the lockdown, but you would expect that, not least because of language skills among some parents, that they were likely to face greater challenges in accessing information from the school. And they were, of course, less likely to be familiar with the Irish curriculum in terms of supporting home learning. Now, the largest number of studies internationally, especially in the first lockdown, focused on the effect of the pandemic restrictions on mental health and well-being. And studies consistently showed very significant increases in self-reported depression and anxiety during the period of restrictions. And this was found to be greater among younger adults and women in particular, with evidence in the English context of a greater deterioration for those with previous mental health difficulties. A number of stressors emerged, but these included loss of job or loss of income, as well as overcrowded accommodation. In Ireland, the CSO covered some of this in their surveys, and they too found a significant decline in adult life satisfaction and marked increases in the proportion who said they felt depressed, anxious, or lonely. And as in other countries, this decline in well-being was more significant among younger adults and among women. Now, we know from pre-COVID research using Growing Up in Ireland data, among others, that there are very strong links between parental well-being, especially maternal depression, and children's socio-emotional outcomes. So we would expect, and we'll see later on what the actual patterns were, but on this basis, we'd expect that the adult patterns would be mirrored, at least to some degree, among children and young people. And as I said earlier, it wasn't just the case that learning was disrupted, but there was a disruption in routine and lack of access to supports for those with special educational needs. So there are issues there too around well-being. Now, to the Growing Up in Ireland survey that was conducted. This was really kind of designed to address this gap in systematic research on young people. The Department of Children had commissioned this work of both GUI cohorts. The survey was carried out online with the support of the Central Statistics Office in December 2020. I know the months blur, but it's probably worth reminding you that this was a period where the second set of national restrictions were being eased in the run up to Christmas. So it's worth bearing that in mind for the kind of responses. The children were back in school, but tertiary education was still largely remote. So we did a survey of the two cohorts, the older cohort known as cohort 98, who'd been followed since they were 9. We asked them now at 22 to complete a survey, and cohort 08, who have been followed from 9 months, were now 12. So the young person themselves completed a survey, but one of their parents, this was usually the primary caregiver, which was generally the mother, to get the parental perspective as well. These links to the survey were sent by email and text. We had got interviewers to follow up on missing email details. This was quite different because previous waves of growing up in Ireland have been face-to-face. The surveys were very brief. They took about 10 minutes to complete, and we had a very short window for logistics purpose for survey completion. So we were pleased with the response rate. And the questions largely, you'll see the answers in the following slides, they largely focused on a core set of key experiences and outcomes. So we generally asked people to compare now, which was December 2020, with the time before the first lockdown, March 2020. So a lot of the questions, as you'll see, were, do you do this more than previously, less than previously, and so on. Now, on the left-hand side, we see activities that people did more of. We've shown the 12-year-old responses, but also the 22-year-old responses for comparative purposes. But you can see that, not surprisingly, that time spent with family increased, that moving to talking to friends online increased, and that the level of informal screen time, which for some young people was already considerable when we interviewed them at previously at 9, had increased. But on the right-hand side, you'll see that some activities had, not surprisingly, decreased. Just under half of the 12-year-olds said they were meeting their friends less than before the pandemic. This was actually lower than was the case for the 22-year-olds. So this largely reflects the fact that the 12-year-olds were back in school, so they did have contact with their friends in that way. But other activities like structured cultural activities like drama, music lessons, and so on, had decreased for a sizable proportion, and a significant proportion had decreased their involvement in sports and exercise. So there's a wider backdrop to the kind of learning loss that we're talking about here, in that a lot of other activities that promote well-being and informal learning, because we know there's a connection between involvement in cultural activities and academic outcomes, that they had fallen off. So in terms of remote learning then, children and the 22-year-olds were asked to what extent these things were always true. So we can see in the orange bar that around only half of the 12-year-olds felt it was always true that they had a quiet place to study. The majority, 3/4, felt they had a suitable computer, but very few, only 1 in 5, reported really regular access to online lessons. And that was much less the case than for those 22-year-olds who were in tertiary education. But as we've seen in other countries, we see a kind of inequality in this respect. We see that those in the highest income quintile are more likely to have access to a quiet place to study. They're more likely to have adequate devices and to have adequate internet connection. So the conditions for learning, if you like, were quite differentiated by income. Another factor that didn't get much attention in the talk about the education experience of young people was the fact that for a group of young people, the lockdown coincided with very significant transitions. So for 2/3 of the group that we're talking about, coming back to school meant moving from primary to second level education, with all the disruption that entailed in itself. So we can see therefore that, you know, finding schoolwork more difficult and finding it hard to settle back was more common amongst those who made the transition, though the levels are reassuringly low in terms of severe difficulties. But it also meant that there was less emphasis on, if you like, catching up for lost learning if they had made the transition to second level. And there was also a greater kind of fear, if you like, about risks from the transmission of COVID in the new setting. We also collected information on the broader well-being of the 12-year-olds, and 22% were in the low mood range on an inventory of mental health difficulties. And that was higher for girls than for boys. And 6% of the parents said that the children had missed out on mental health support because of the pandemic. But then at the same time, you know, a significant group ranked themselves 10 out of 10 on the degree of excitement about 2021. But as I said, December 2020 was a relatively hopeful time before the next wave. There's an issue about whether the impact on learning and indeed on well-being is short-term and will be expected to settle down, if you like. The scale of the impact that we've had has been unprecedented, so it can be quite difficult to look at appropriate comparators. Existing studies of learning loss that have tended to look at things like teacher strikes or the disruption caused by Hurricane Katrina have tended to focus on short-term outcomes. But there is evidence from things like Hurricane Katrina, 9/11, which point to longer-term effects on children's anxiety levels. Given the level of unmet demand for child and adolescent mental health services pre-COVID, this is of concern. And in a way, we would expect that the duration of the impact on children will depend on the duration of the disruption. And we see that with kind of being labeled close contact, we're seeing ongoing learning disruption, even though schools are open. And also on the level to which a financial strain persists, with parental stress, as we know, affecting children's well-being. Just to kind of briefly conclude and then talk about the policy impact or policy implications rather. As in other countries, we see evidence of a widening of pre-COVID patterns of inequality in Ireland. We see significant learning loss, especially among the disadvantaged and those with special needs. And we would argue a risk of dropout, but we haven't seen any figures on the number of young people who have not returned to school. We would expect an indirect effect as well, in that children will be affected by increased parental stress, which will persist for that group that face sustained unemployment and some financial strain arising from the phasing out of the pandemic payment. And we know from previous research using Growing Up in Ireland that recessions do impact quite negatively on children's educational development and their socio-emotional well-being. Now, a lot of the focus in Irish policy, education policy, has been on the logistics of safe return to school. And there's been less attention to talking about learning loss and well-being. There have been some measures. There was a 2-week summer program run in 2020 for schools serving disadvantaged populations and for those with disabilities. This was extended to all schools in 2021, but it was a 2-week program. So, you know, the effects are likely modest. This month, a 50 million fund called the COVID Learning and Support Scheme class was announced to provide additional teaching hours for schools. Now, the number of hours the schools is based on enrollment numbers, and there's a 10% additional allocation then for disadvantaged schools, and there's a larger additional allocation for special schools. And it was announced that this would happen on a one-off basis, so for this year only. The guidelines indicate that the schools should focus on those who are most impacted, but they allow for the fact that schools may wish to provide short targeted support for some others. On the very positive side, it does place learning loss in the context of well-being more generally, and does allow for the possibility of doing things like running social activities at lunchtime as part of this. But it is worth mentioning that kind of the level of support is very modest. For example, for a school of 600 students, the additional teaching hours will be 625 for the full year, which is modest. And Luke will say more about what's being done in England. And I think we can learn a lot, not just by the level of support, but also by how that support has been implemented. So in terms of policy priorities, the international evidence would point to the important role of one-to-one tuition and small group supports in kind of bridging the gap in learning. And it's questionable whether, the scale of resources announced so far is sufficient to do that. We do really need to be looking at additional supports to assist the readjustment of children with Chzhen. And the issue of socio-emotional difficulties is really important. We've seen the kind of group with low mood. For the young adults, it's an even worse situation. So we might expect that the older teenagers would be faring worse as well. There's potential for within school support through programs like the school completion program, but there is quite clearly a need for a broader spectrum, which includes therapeutic supports for those children and young people with kind of more serious difficulties in order to avoid longer term damage. So thank you very much for listening. I leave it at that.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Emer. That was a really good overview of, I think research in the area and what we know has happened and hasn't. Next up is Dr. Chzhen from Barra Sociology in Trinity College Dublin. And Kat, I'll hand it over to you now.
Thanks, Barra. Let me know if you're having any difficulties with seeing my slides. I assume it's okay. All right then, so Emer is a tough act to follow, but nevertheless, instead of a broad brush overview of what was happening in Ireland during the now many waves of the COVID-19 pandemic, I will zoom in on the very first lockdown that happened in the spring 2020. This is Schools at Work with the Children's School Life Study at the UCD, and also with some colleagues from the Interdisciplinary Child Wellbeing Network. This is also still work in progress, but these results are kind of good enough to present already. I'm having some trouble with, okay, great. I can change my slides. So for some of us, this period is still quite fresh in our minds, but just to go back over it very briefly, the 2019-2020 school year started as normal, with no one expecting what was coming. And then obviously by the end of February, there was the first confirmed COVID case in Ireland. And just about 2 weeks later, there was an announcement that all schools would be shut and all learning would be taking place remotely. At first, school closures were supposed to only be for 2 weeks, but very soon it became obvious to everyone that it would be more protracted. And indeed, schools remained closed until the end of the academic year. And for primary school children in Ireland, of course, that was the end of June. Now, this study is based on the results from the Children's School Lives fieldwork. I'll tell you more about the study in a moment, but fieldwork was taking place from May until July. So it started during school closures and ended a few weeks after the end of the school year. Now, schools then reopened in September 2020, and then eventually there would be another lockdown. And even now, as Emer already mentioned, even though schools are open, there is still plenty of disruption to learning And some commentators are calling it stop-start learning, because children have to stay at home in quarantine while they're waiting for their test results, and sometimes longer than that. So back to the spring 2020, what happened was extremely abrupt. No one was ready for the first lockdown. Children, parents, teachers, principals, assistants, all educators. This was extremely rapid, but by and large, this transition to remote schooling happened. And so teaching and learning never stopped. It just took a different form. At the same time, this was happening all over the world. And so everyone who has anything to say on this was shouting very loudly and publishing in very reputable publications that there would be learning loss associated with these types of school closures, and inequalities in children's education would widen for sure. Now, why is that? Because the COVID-19 pandemic is unprecedented in modern times, and yet we know plenty about socioeconomic inequalities in children's education. And so we could expect those to widen. And we also know that the pandemic itself has affected different households differently, and those who are already more disadvantaged to begin with experienced worse impacts for a whole number of reasons. Since learning would be taking place remotely, children would be needing reliable digital technologies, good internet access, and that's not always something that everyone has access to. Children would also need a lot more support from their parents, but we do know that not all parents are equally well placed to provide this type of support to their children. So by now, we have plenty of rigorous evidence from across the world that suggests that learning loss has happened, is happening, and they're also widening in socioeconomic inequalities, both in learning measured via standardized assessments, and also in sort of softer measures of learning, such as amount of time spent on learning activities. There is a widely cited study from the Netherlands that some of you may already be familiar with, that very nicely demonstrated that even a reasonably short period of school closures that happened in the Netherlands in the spring 2020, one of the shortest school closures overall among rich countries. And also the Netherlands happens to be one of the best countries for internet access. It's widely available and high quality. So it's almost the best case for something like this happening. And even there was substantial and statistically significant learning loss. This study is also really nicely positioned to assess the amount of learning loss, because national standardized assessments in primary schools in the Netherlands took place as scheduled just before the start of the lockdown, and then sometime after the lockdown towards the summer 2020. And so the results of these assessments could be compared to those of a different cohort of children not affected by COVID from a few years prior, with various adjustments made. And not only was there learning loss, but it was also quite unequal, socially stratified by parental education in particular. Similar results are coming out from other countries, and these papers are being published almost every day now. I have just found out that there is a study from France that showed that in September 2020, primary school children returned to schools, and those same children could read and do maths to a lower standard than before. So there was actual learning loss in those children, but it could be reversed, because by January, it was already made up for, except for those children who were the most disadvantaged. So you can catch up, but even the rate of catching up can be unequal. At the same time, we have a lot of studies, many of them from the United Kingdom, from survey research that shows that learning time, or the amount of time that children spend on various homeschooling activities, that amount of time is highly unequal and socioeconomically stratified. So this brings us to this particular study, which is not based on standardized assessments or even measures of learning time. Our dependent variable here is emotional engagement in remote schooling. We use children's reports, and we're particularly interested, at least were in the beginning, in any socioeconomic gradients in children's engagement. So we expected there to be a steep socioeconomic gradient. We also expected children who have better conditions and better resources for remote learning to engage with it to a great extent. And also, since we have some assessments from teachers of children's behavior and things like that before COVID, we expected that those who fared better before the pandemic would be engaging with remote schooling to a great extent. Now, a few words about this study itself. It's an ongoing mixed method study. So there is a quantitative component, and this is what we're using here, and a qualitative component. It started in 2019 with surveys carried out in schools based on a nationally representative sample of primary schools across the country. And then in 2020, data collection could not take place as scheduled because of the pandemic. So everything pivoted online very quickly, and there was a web-based survey from May to July 2020. We are drawing on data from children themselves who were 8 and 9 years old in 2019, and then obviously 1 year older in 2020. Emotional engagement with remote schooling is quite an important variable because, generally speaking, children who like schooling more do better at school, and then it's self-reinforcing, then they do better and they like their schooling more, and so on and so forth. So by looking at these measures, we can get a broad brush estimate of how children were actually coping with this rapid transition to online schooling. So the questions are adapted from a student life satisfaction scale, and this is a validated measure of school climate in more normal times, and then it had to be adapted to remote schooling. But basically, there are 5 questions posed to children, and they tap into this one underlying latent factor that's pretty much their emotional engagement, or how much they actually like homeschooling, how interesting they find it, and so on and so forth. So all of these 5 questions are highly correlated with each other. They do form a reliable scale. They load on one latent factor. So that's all good. What's less good is that it's very difficult to gather information on household socioeconomics from young children. So they're 8, 9 years old, and one way of gaining such information is asking them about various possessions, such as cars and computers that they have in their homes, and also how often they tend to go on family holidays. And then by summing up the numbers of holidays, computers, and cars, we have a scale from 0 to 7. The family affluence scale is commonly used in school-based surveys of children, often those who are aged 11 and over, but it's also been validated in younger children. Now, what we cannot ask 9-year-olds is how much money their parents are earning, and even information on parental education and occupational status is hard to get reliably. So this is why a family affluence scale is used instead. We have questions on resources for home learning collected during the COVID wave, and that is whether the children are doing their homework on a computer or a laptop as opposed to a tablet or a smartphone. So everyone had at least one of these, and 30% of the children said that they were doing their schoolwork on a computer or a laptop, and everybody else pretty much had to use some form of tablet. We also have a question on whether they can get help, presumably from parents and or teachers if they're worried about their schoolwork, and also how often their schoolwork is checked, again, either by parents or teachers. At the same time, we have information from wave 1, including that collected from teachers. So, for example, how often that particular child used to arrive at school without homework. Teacher assessments of children's socio-emotional and behavior difficulties from the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire are used too, and we have some very simple demographic controls as well. So I'll go quickly here. So unfortunately, not every household took part in the Wave 2 web-based survey. And even among those who agreed, not everyone answered all the questions. So in the end, from roughly 2,000 children at Wave 1, we have fewer than 400 children in our analytic sample in the end. And that sample is very much positively self-selected on things like whether you live with both parents, the family affluence score, speaking English at home, and also, whether you used to come to school with your homework completed, and whether you have lower scores on behavioral and emotional difficulties. So at least we know how children are selected into Wave 2. So we adjust for potential unobservable differences between schools, but apart from that, the analysis is very, very straightforward. So the main results are that girls are a lot more likely to be, well, girls show higher levels of engagement with remote schooling. They like it more than boys. But the only other factor that is comparable in size to the gender difference is having a computer or a laptop rather than a smartphone or a tablet for remote schooling, as well as being able to get help if worried about homework. So those are the largest predictors, the strongest predictors of engagement. And then at the same time, children who have higher behavior difficulty scores, more specifically hyperactivity or inattention, are engaging with their schooling to a significantly lesser extent. Now, what we do not see here is anything around the family affluence scale. It's a small positive coefficient, but it's not significantly different from 0. Same with living with both parents or not, or main language spoken at home. So the main thing that is related to socioeconomics is whether you have a computer or laptop for remote schooling. So in the end, we were somewhat surprised that the family affluence scale didn't seem to make any difference, but it could well be that it's because our sample is quite self-selected positively, although we do adjust for that in a whole number of different ways, and it doesn't seem to make any difference, which leaves the possibility that the family affluence scale is simply a bad measure of family socioeconomic status. Or perhaps there aren't so many socioeconomic differences in emotional engagement with schooling, even though they may be in actual standardized assessments and learning loss. Now, it's obvious that having digital resources for homeschooling is incredibly important, so we're not surprised to see this in our study as well. And also having access to help. It's very difficult for young children to engage with their remote schooling without at least some help. Now, something that we did not have any major hypothesis about beforehand was the strength and difficulties questionnaire scores, but it does come out very strongly here that those with inattention or hyperactivity are struggling to engage with their homeschooling. And this is consistent with the evidence that is now coming out about children with special educational needs struggling with this in particular. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Kat. Great to see the results from that study, and that there's lots of work going on, I suppose, on children's lives in Ireland during this pandemic. Our final speaker, before we open it up to kind of Q&A, and I do encourage you to submit your questions if you can via the Q&A box there, that should appear for most of you, is Luke Sibieta. Again, Luke is a research fellow at both the Education and Policy Institute and Institute for Fiscal Studies over in London, and director of the Sibieta Economics of Education. So Luke, thanks very much for joining us today. And Luke, I think you're going to tell us a bit about how things have panned out across the border there, where you are.
Thanks very much, Barra. Remember to unmute before I talk, which is always a good skill to have. So as Barra said, my name is Sibieta. I'm a research fellow at the Education Policy Institute and the Institute of Fiscal Studies. And I'm going to be giving you an overview of some pieces of work we've done looking at the potential long-run effects of learning loss during the pandemic and the potential for education recovery policy and spending to try and help pupils catch up and reduce inequalities. Sorry, we can change the slide now. So as I said, I'll be looking at the potential long-run consequences of missed schooling, but spending more time looking at the size and nature of the best policy response. That includes the overall level and focus of the policy response, but also the potential role of tutoring and an extended school day to help pupils catch up. I should say from the start that much of the data is from a UK perspective, but most of the policy lessons are much wider, extended across all countries. So I think it's always worth stepping back a bit to think about what the theoretical determinants are going to be of lost learning, and what we know about the way that skills and learning accumulates over the life cycle is that it's fundamentally a dynamic process. And pupils tend to learn more at younger ages, and how much pupils can learn at a given age often depends on what they've learned in the past as well. And this has some very powerful predictions for the potential effects of learning loss. So firstly, there's the idea of sensitive periods. So it's potential that younger children may have missed out on more learning, and this has a long-term effect on those pupils, largely because it's happened at a sensitive period during their learning. There's also the notions of self-productivity and dynamic complementarity. So it may be that lower levels of skills can restrict children's ability to gain further skills at later ages, and that may also depress the effect of later investments. So inequalities can grow over the lifetime as a response. It's also important to see the interaction between parents and schools, and we know for a fact that parents have been providing more homeschooling during lockdowns, but there's likely to be a low ability of disadvantaged parents to help with that lost learning, which will only lead to wider inequalities. In thinking through the potential long-run effects of this lost learning, we know from a very, very wide body of research that there are higher returns to more years of schooling and more educational qualifications. And the average is about an 8% return to a year of schooling in international reviews, with even higher returns in some UK-based literature. But the key question here is whether that return to a year of schooling reflects higher skills and learning, or whether it reflects a signal of underlying ability. And there has been some commentators speculating that there might not be any effects of lost learning because fundamentally abilities are unchanged and schooling is just a method of sorting out who's able and who's not. But most of the research on trying to separate the role of signaling and human capital finds very much in favor of human capital and skills as determining individuals' productivities and earnings, such that there could be quite big long-run effects of lost learning. It's also important to see the wider effects of education, which will only increase the costs of lost learning. There is already a significant body of research showing that high levels of education and schooling can improve innovation and technological progress and can improve well-being, social-emotional skills and health. So if we lose those potential wider benefits of education, the consequences could be very, very large indeed. And we already know that there has been strong evidence of lost learning across various countries and contexts. So I'm not going to take you through all the studies that are involved, but here's just a brief sample of them, both the UK, Holland, and the US. And what's remarkable about the studies is how consistent they are in terms of the patterns. So we know that children have fell behind by about 2 to 4 months by spring 2021. And we also know the sorts of pupils and in what subjects they've fallen behind the most. So younger pupils and more disadvantaged pupils have fallen behind by the most. And we also know that pupils have fallen behind more in maths than they have in literacy and reading. And that's quite interesting because it also coincides with what's been found for the disruptions of snow and other weather events in the US, which finds that maths is more affected by not being in schools than literacy and reading. Then thinking through the potential long-run effects of lost learning, obviously there's considerable uncertainty in terms of what's going to happen with future earnings and the extent to which there has been lost learning. Whilst there's consistency, there's also disagreement about the actual level of it. So in our work, we construct various scenarios for potential lost earnings as a result of school disruption, which range from an optimistic scenario where it's only 1% loss to earnings to a more pessimistic scenario where it's around a 3.5% loss to earnings. And that's based on the research that's been done on lost learning, but also an assumed 8% return to a year of schooling. So that's quite a range, and to some extent they sound relatively small, but when you look in the context of lifetime earnings, that can equate to, even the optimistic scenario would be something in the range of 10 to 15,000 euros, whilst the pessimistic scenario would be more like 50 to 60, 70,000 euros per person. So whilst they're small in absolute terms, these can accumulate to quite big numbers over an individual's lifetime. They also coincide quite well with previous examples of big disruptions to children's learning. And it also shows the role that recovery and policy can make in terms of shaping those long-run effects. They're not inevitable and can be shaped by what we do now. So in Argentina, there were a series of teacher strikes that meant pupils missed out on the equivalent of about 2/3 of a year of schooling. And if we look, research that's been done looking at the evidence on those long-run effects, find that reduced lifetime earnings by around 2 to 3%, which is quite close to what we sort of project as part of our central and pessimistic scenarios. And if we look further back in history to World War II, the children in Austria and Germany who missed out on about a year of schooling saw their earnings reduced by about 10% as a result of missed schooling. But at the other end of the scale, there are examples where there have not been big long-run effects of lost learning, particularly in Germany in the 1960s, where there were a series of short school years to try and change the date of when children started schooling. That was done in a very organized and planned way, as you'd expect for German policymaking. But it ensured that the curriculum was covered as best as possible within those short school years, and that pupils who couldn't quite keep pace with the fast curriculum were able to repeat a year and make up on that lost learning. And in that context, there was no evidence in effect on long-run earnings. There's also been modelling done on the effects of the current crisis, which suggests that if there was a big parental response to try and help pupils with their learning during the crisis, then the lost earnings may be relatively small. But it's important to state that assumes a really quite big response in terms of what parents did in terms of homeschooling, and that would still be very, very socially graded. So then moving on to think about the potential policy response. The risk of substantial and quite unequal impact, in my view, justifies a relatively large policy response with extra funds targeted at more disadvantaged pupils to try and reduce the potential for inequalities to widen. And we know from the research that's been done on the effects of school spending that providing extra resources can really help in terms of helping pupils with their learning. So evidence in the late 2000s in the UK shows that extra £1,000 for people can lead to a relatively big improvement in educational progress. And particularly the evidence that's come from the US has showed that extra spending on resources is more valuable to disadvantaged pupils, who are the ones we're perhaps most concerned about during the current crisis. However, extra money on its own doesn't necessarily buy you better outcomes and reduced inequalities. It has to be focused on high quality provision and what works. And the key determinant here will be whether schools and government can train and recruit high quality staff, as they're fundamentally the most important part of any education system for determining the quality of outputs. support will also need to reflect the unequal and multifaceted nature of lost schooling. We've already heard quite a lot about the emotional impact of lockdown and the effect on social emotional outcomes and mental health. So it's really important that policy response, a focus on mental health is a big part of the policy response. But there's also going to need to focus on where inequalities are in the school system and the extent of lost learning, whether it's larger or smaller for secondary pupils, and focusing on disadvantaged pupils and younger pupils in particular. So looking across countries in terms of the extent of catch-up spending. So for the UK, we've looked at the impact, estimated the level of catch-up spending across the 4 nations of the UK, which ranges from around £230 for people in Scotland and Northern Ireland to £300 in England, about £400 per pupil in Wales. And that's relatively generous in terms of providing maybe about 5% extra on top of the annual schools budgets in those countries. But it's relatively small compared with the sort of 2 best performers in this area, which are the US and the Netherlands, which are both spending something closer to £2,000 per pupil on education recovery spending. And it's worth saying a little bit about what they're doing with that. So the US has allocated around $129 billion for education recovery spending. Some of that is for COVID mitigation and measures and trying to prevent layoffs. But most of the funding is focused on providing states with extra money to provide education recovery. And that's focused on extended school time and also summer schools in the most recent months. But by far the sort of standout performer, both in terms of the overall level and in the approach, is the Netherlands. Now they've allocated around £2,100 per pupil. Some of that is for discounts on higher education fees, but most of it, the vast majority, is focused on school spending. And the way they've approached it, as I said, is also exemplary in many ways. So schools and school boards are meant to work together to identify specific challenges and inequalities, and together develop a plan for how to combat those inequalities and problems in their local area. And they're also instructed to evaluate and monitor the different approaches they choose. And they've got a lot of freedom and autonomy to determine exactly what approaches to take, but it's slightly constrained autonomy in that they're forced to pick from approaches from a menu of options that are quite backed up by strong empirical evidence, which increases the chance that the approaches taken will be ones that improve outcomes and overall quality in the school system. So in terms of where to go for the sort of best approach and level, it's very much the Netherlands. So finally, well, not quite finally, but in terms of the next part, I wanted to talk about 2 areas that have received quite a lot of attention as potential strategies to help pupils catch up on lost learning. And one is tutoring, and the other is extended school time. And as has already been indicated, there's a strong evidence pointing to the effectiveness of small group tuition, and that's a really strong body of evidence by now, with the average effect being around 0.3 to 0.4 standard deviations across a variety of countries. That's equivalent to around 3 to 4 months of educational progress. And these programs vary in their length, as you would expect, but they're generally about 1 to 2 hours per week for 10 to 20 weeks, either as 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 or 1-to-3. That's how it's been tried so far. But whilst there's a sort of big average effect, there's lots we can learn from the different ways it's been implemented, and how we can leverage bigger impacts. So who delivers the tutoring has a really big role to play in determining the potential effectiveness. It's more effective when it's delivered by professionals with more human capital and training. As you would expect, when it's delivered by highly qualified and high quality teachers, it has the biggest effect. But they're also, those are equivalent to around 0.5 standard deviations. But it's still effective when it's being delivered by teacher assistants and paraprofessionals with good quality training. So delivery by teachers is probably the most effective, but that's also the most expensive way to deliver it. It's still highly effective when it's delivered by teaching assistants and paraprofessionals with a good level of training. In terms of when in the children's lives it has the most effect, it's generally seen to have the most effect at younger ages in literacy, but is still highly effective for maths throughout primary school ages, which is encouraging given we know pupils have probably fallen behind more in maths than they have done in literacy and reading. In terms of how it's delivered, it's perhaps slightly surprising. It's more effective when it's delivered during the school day rather than after school. And also slightly surprised, it's generally more effective when it's longer and more frequent, but not as more effective as you'd expect it to be. And that leads on neatly into sort of the why tutoring is effective, which I think is really important in understanding how to craft the best policy response. And so one part of the reason why tutoring might be effective is because it provides additional time and sort of lower ratios. But the fact that it's then more effective in school rather than after school, where it would add more time, suggests that the additional time and resource isn't perhaps playing the leading role here. And it may well be down to what tutoring does in itself, in the sense that it can allow for more customization of what happens in learning and more rapid feedback, both for the tutor and the tutee, in terms of understanding the needs of that particular pupil and how best to help them. There's also the potential for a sort of mentoring or pastoral relationship to develop between the tutor and the tutee that might help in terms of developing confidence, which I think is really important for understanding the best way to approach tutoring. And it suggests that it's better done when it's as part of the school rather than being treated as completely separate and something that happens in the evening by an outside organisation that doesn't then feed back into the school for understanding how to help that pupil in the long run as well. In terms of extending school time and its sort of extended school day or its school year, there's what I'd say is mostly positive evidence on the effects of a longer school day and a longer school year, but it clearly depends on how that school time is used. We see positive evidence across country studies, but also in individual places like Wisconsin, Chile, and Japan. But there are also examples where it hasn't worked out so well. And if we look at sort of meta-analysis and reviews of a longer school day, that it shows that after-school programs vary in terms of their effectiveness, and sometimes can be very positive and sometimes not have much of an effect. The evidence on extracurricular activities is relatively weak, both in the sense that there isn't that much strong evidence, but there's also found to have quite small effects. But that's when researchers have been using extracurricular activities on attainment outcomes. And our aspirations of what extracurricular activities are for in terms of pupils' wider well-being, I think, is much wider than just looking at pupil attainment. But I think we can also learn a lot from the cases where extended school day programs have been effective and where they haven't been effective. So there are some really good examples where it has been effective in southern Italy and Israel, Denmark, Pittsburgh, and in Dublin, whereby extra school time was able to improve pupil outcomes. But in all these cases, programs involved existing or very well-trained teachers and staff. The programs became part of the school day. They were focused on relatively traditional teaching methods, and we also know they had a bigger impact on maths. So when extended school days have been part of what the school's been doing, either in terms of using existing teachers in school buildings and approaches, as was the case in southern Italy, then they tend to have bigger effects. The cases where extended school day programs didn't have much effect were cases that involved less trained staff, where they were quite separate to the normal school day and involved less proven approaches. And there are a number of these cases. In the US, extended school day programs were rolled out quite thoroughly during the 2000s, but they were often really quite separate to the school day. They were very poorly attended, and they involved activities and approaches that were based on quite shaky evidence. In the Netherlands, there was an extended school day program that involved pupils having to walk across town to another building, being taught by a completely separate teacher in a completely separate teaching method to what they were doing during their normal school day. And that ended up having quite almost no effect on pupil outcomes. So I think the lesson from the research on the extended school day is that the more it can be integrated into what the school is already doing, in terms of the curriculum, the activity, the staff, then the greater the chance that that would have a positive impact. And so I think there are probably some really quite strong common lessons from both the tutoring and the extended school day literature. I always summarize schools and teachers are quite good at education in terms of what they're doing already. So trying to leverage bigger impacts is the best way to do it. And the ways to do that include providing better training. So increasing the human capital and knowledge of staff can increase the effect. School ownership is really quite important as well. So there's an increased impact of these programs when they're effectively integrated into the existing curriculum or existing activities of the school, so that it just becomes part of the normal routine at school and can be then fed back into how schools are delivering education. It's also important to monitor and evaluate different activities to ensure it's providing good quality. And we also must be aware that there will be different impacts across ages and subjects, with potential for bigger impacts at lower ages and potential more impact on maths. So to summarize and conclude, the current evidence across most countries suggests learning loss around 2 to 4 months, depending on the study and the context. But what's really clear is that there are bigger impacts on maths, younger pupils and more disadvantaged pupils. And in my mind, the risk of a quite substantial and unequal impact justifies a relatively large response focused more on disadvantaged pupils. And here there is really strong positive evidence for the role that tutoring and extended learning time can play in terms of helping pupils catch up. And we can leverage bigger impacts where we can improve the human capital of staff with good quality training, increased impact when they're well attended and effectively become part of the school day. But there's also a need to focus on what we already know in terms of the evidence on what works, and evaluating and monitoring what schools do and what teachers do to ensure that it's faithful to the evidence in terms of what can best help pupils catch up in the long run. So that's where I'll stop and hope that I've kept the time.
You have indeed, Luke. Thank you
Good.
very much for that. That was an excellent overview of, I think, the work you've been doing and work others have been doing in the area. Again, thanks to all three panelists for their presentations. We'll move on to the Q&A for about kind of 20 minutes or so, 50. So please do send in your questions via the Q&A box. I think we've got one or two starting to kind of come in now. But maybe we can just kick off while people are kind of collecting themselves and entering their questions by maybe Emer and Kat, could I ask you just kind of to take into account what Luke has just shown us there about the evidence and what we know, and what do you think yourself, and what can we learn on that essentially for the policy response here, particularly Emer, I think picking up on what you said was maybe quite modest levels of provision so far that's been announced.
Well, I think Luke has kind of argued very convincingly for the need for large-scale response, given the scale. And Ireland has had quite a lot of closures by international standards. I mean, as I've said already, the amount that's been given is quite modest. So you're probably talking about small group additional tuition for very small numbers within a school. And the challenge then for the school in identifying those who've experienced the greatest impact. I think DEIS schools will have had more experience through the school completion programme in identifying at-risk students, but I think others might struggle to be able to kind of harness those. But I mean, Luke has put the evidence across better than any of us could reiterate. It's clear what we need. It's kind of about trying to get it. And I think that the link too with well-being is crucial. I think the two things need to be tied. It needs to be additional support, learning support, but provided in an engaged way that recognises some of the socio-emotional challenges that they're facing as well.
Yes, it's hard to add anything to this, but what strikes me about living in Ireland right now is how little public discourse there is around learning loss. And, at the moment, there is no hard data on the amount of learning loss among primary or secondary school children. If anything, if we look at living certificate results, it would almost appear as if there is no learning loss at all, but that's just an artifact of a different grading system. So now that we have such nicely put together evidence from Luke, it really would be great to start advocating for a much more large-scale response here in Ireland. And the only other thing is that while it's so incredibly important to focus resources on those who are most at risk of falling behind, there may almost be some sort of U-shaped curve now, that those who are kind of most at risk will get some help, and those who are at the very end of the distribution will be okay, but those in the middle will be kind of falling through the cracks in all sorts of possible ways. So I would also just, raise the question of the median student, somebody who is neither particularly behind nor particularly ahead of everyone else.
Okay, thanks very much both. So we have a question in kind of on a related subject, and I suppose one thing that maybe came up a little bit at one stage of discussion is what about those students who never returned back to school and then schooling completion? It'd be great to get all your thoughts on, do we have any evidence in Ireland or abroad about whether we saw people essentially finishing school earlier than they would have, or was the fact that there wasn't many jobs or much fun to be had in the world at the time because of the shutdowns? Did that mean that people stayed in school? So it'd be great to get again people's views on that, and again what the appropriate kind of policy response might be to should we be trying to bring these people back, or how should we be trying to capture those who maybe have fallen through the cracks and not finished their schooling that they might have otherwise done?
With your permission, I'll start on that one. So I know from a UK perspective that in terms of staying on rates after school, they've increased quite strongly during the crisis, and that's partly because employment prospects and training prospects have been so poor that the kind of only default option is to continue in formal education. And it's also the result in the UK because of the way we did leaving grades meant that there was huge grade inflation, so that pupils had increased chance of being able to stay on in education. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't problems about disengagement and dropping out. And one thing we've seen across all studies of learning loss, or almost all, is that there is this concerning bit at the very bottom of the distribution, where perhaps about 2 to 3% extra pupils just aren't willing to take the test or available or score incredibly low. That's wouldn't normally be an issue in studies because you kind of just ignore the extremes, but it's such a big change with previous surveys that it's incredibly worrying. And so that I think there is a real concern that maybe a small number of extra pupils who have completely disengaged from schooling as a result of lockdowns or the stress of remote learning that are just really hard to get back. And it could be a really small number, as I said, around 1, 2, 3% of young people. But the costs of disengagement and people who just don't engage with the formal school system and then drop out can have really quite long run consequences for those pupils and for public policy more generally.
In Ireland, like we had done prior to COVID, we'd done really well at increasing school retention to bring upper secondary completion to way over 90%, which is great. I haven't seen any figures yet on the impact, but like Luke, I would expect there has been an impact for some groups at least. And the difficulty is the kind of lack of tracking. If someone is above the legal school leaving age of 16 or 3 years of lower secondary, whichever is highest, there isn't the follow-up if they drop out. And we know from the work that we did on the Youth Reach program, which is second chance for early leavers, we know that kind of getting into that really relies on word of mouth. It relies on kind of informal networks that very few people come through formal channels and are identified and targeted. So I think there's a risk that some young people will fall between the cracks. We also know that those early leavers now have become more negatively selected and often have mental health difficulties alongside kind of other difficulties. So again, it could be a kind of perfect or an imperfect storm for that group. So I think it would be concerning, and it would certainly be important to put in place a tracking system to follow up those who don't return to school.
Kat, do you want to come in on that, or?
I don't have very much to add to this, but you know, in the global south, this is a bigger problem in a way than particular types of learning loss based on standardized tests, because there are now, you know, millions of children not coming back to school, many of them girls. So, you know, we're privileged in Ireland and the United Kingdom that, you know, we don't have that scale of a problem, nothing like it. But certainly we do need to have some form of tracking in place, as Emer said, because it may be, you know, very small numbers of people, but it's their lives, their livelihoods on the line, and their mental health. So we do have to care about each and every one of them.
Thanks for that. So another question in here, I think, Kat, you answered it partly in the chat, but some people have been asking about different forms of remote schooling, and just, you know, it wasn't a uniform experience, I suppose, offered by schools, particularly in the first lockdown, but even throughout that, schools maybe took different approaches to that. Does anyone have any thoughts on, I suppose, whether we have any evidence on a particular type of remote learning being more effective than others, and also about if we're going to, hopefully not, but if we're going to have maybe more regular pandemics than once in a century over the coming century, whether we should be putting in place more standardized ways, I suppose, of providing that, or more formalized ways of providing that learning, and what kind of, again, the best practice is in if we have to do remote learning, how should we do that?
I suppose I can start because I typed it in the chat. So the good news is that the Children's School Life study does have a teacher questionnaire. So in spring 2020, teachers did answer questions about how exactly they were teaching remotely, what sort of platforms they were using, synchronous, asynchronous. Now, I do not have permission to speak about these data, but all I can say is that they exist, and there will be links made to the national assessment results done this year. And the data are not publicly available yet at all. But, you know, eventually this will be coming out, and it's clearly a very interesting research question, and also, you know, something that is on many parents' minds, those who survived the past 2 years homeschooling their children. The bad news is that we don't have these analyses today.
Emer or Luke, do you want, either of you want to come in on that?
I mean,
or is that?
I think, as Kat said, I mean, it's a real knowledge gap. You know, but one thing I would say is that all of our other work points to the importance of the student-teacher relationship in promoting positive academic and non-academic outcomes. So you kind of do wonder about the impact on that kind of relational piece, and how easy it is to maintain that remotely, regardless of the kinds of methodology that you use.
And I just echo what Emer has said in the sense that I'm not aware of any good evidence that's been able to link a remote teaching method to pupil outcomes in any meaningful way so far. So it's very much an evidence gap. But I also, and I should state this at the start, this is kind of pure speculation, but I think there's, well, there has been a bit too much speculation that sort of virtual classrooms and sort of virtual learning is the best way to approach learning online. But I'm not aware of good evidence to suggest that is. And as Emer said, I suspect it's more about the methods that have allowed to maintain a stronger teacher-student relationship and have allowed for feedback to be given to students to allow them to continue with what they're doing, particularly for secondary school age pupils. One of my worries, I had lots of worries during lockdown, including about my own children, but but one of my main worries about the system was secondary school pupils who got stuck on particular topics and issues that weren't getting good feedback from teachers in terms of how to then become unstuck that they'd normally get in the classroom for like 5, 10, 15 minutes. And missing out on those points could have really quite big consequences, because particularly at secondary school age, if you get stuck, you can get really, really quite stuck.
No, absolutely. So maybe just to loop back, and again, questions still very much welcome from the audience if there's anything you particularly want to raise. But Luke, one of the things that were really striking in your presentation was about the small group tutoring and how effective it can be, particularly when implemented in along those kind of lines that you discussed. So is this kind of a growing part? Do you see this as kind of like something that we should be placing greater emphasis on in general, not just for catch up? And again, where is that being kind of done well? And Emer and Kat, your thoughts also kind of welcome after Luke on that.
Yes, so I think a really good part of the UK's policy response has been the greater use of small group tutoring. And that partly follows on from a campaign that was about trying to make teacher assistants and paraprofessionals more involved in tutoring even before the pandemic. So it kind of follows on from existing trends. But it's happened across all 4 nations of the UK. In England, it's happened in the form of the National Tutoring Programme that was led by a group of charities with funding from the government that's tried to increase the supply of effective and high quality tutors and allow them to create a sort of portal and menu of tutors that can deliver one-to-one or one-to-small group tutoring, and hasn't always met government targets, but the extent to which they've delivered an entire 1 billion program from scratch over 12 months, I think, has been really quite impressive. So the focus on the National Tutoring Programme in England and in-school tutoring in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland has been a really good part of the UK's policy response.
Just maybe on that issue, yeah, absolutely. As Luke said earlier, the evidence base for small group tuition is very strong. But I know, and Luke can correct me, that there has been a bit of controversy about the use of external tutors and how they mesh into the school and the quality of those tutors. So, I mean, my preference would be for people to kind of, for this to involve school staff, for that to be the approach, so that there is continuity in the approach of teaching and learning across the school, that there is, it's not separate from other aspects of school climate. You're not having someone who drops in and just delivers a piece. And I think that's very important, that it's kind of a whole school approach as well. I don't know if you want to say anything about that controversy, Luke.
Yeah, so there has been a little bit of controversy about the way contracts have been awarded and the fact that some of the tutoring has been very much online as opposed to in person. And that's to some extent understandable given the way the pandemic has panned out. But we don't have good evidence on the effect that online tutoring has. And I sort of share Emer's concerns that if tutoring is very separate to what the school is doing and doesn't integrate with existing teachers and curriculum and approaches, then you potentially lose some of the benefits of tutoring that can be that customization and feedback and relationship between student and teacher and professional. I don't necessarily think that sort of contracted out tutoring necessarily is a bad thing, because there are lots of groups in England that provide really effective tutoring for schools, and schools are very happy with what they're doing, and that's partly because they have a good relationship with that charity or organisation. So I think it's fundamentally about the extent to which the tutor can have a really strong relationship with the school, and that can happen as part of an in-school approach. And I think to some extent that would be the ideal approach. But if it's not possible, then working with charities and other organisations, but maintaining that strong relationship can be as effective as well.
No, I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay, maybe just so one thing, maybe just to that's on my mind. Unless any final questions come in from the panel, is I suppose one of the things we have here going on in Ireland is a demographic structure where the numbers of kids coming into schools are declining, and I suppose does that, given that we currently have a level of resources allocated and level of teachers there, what kind of, if that does free up space for changing around or shifting the way we currently teach, what are the type of things that you might prioritize in the, I suppose, coming decades with the greater number of teachers available potentially, or resources available for students, or do we have that? Is that something that the demographics offers or not?
I'll jump in. We'd see the effect at primary level first, before the kind of numbers start to fall down at secondary level. Potentially, but we have so many primary schools, and some of them are so small already that, you know what I mean, we may not see the reward in the same way. I think we should be thinking of more of moving towards kind of like more innovative. Well, it's not innovative, it's well known, but using more co-teaching and, more small group tuition, as we've said. I mean, it would free up the kind of resources a little bit, but I think back to what we've been saying today is this is time sensitive, that the recovery from the pandemic, younger students will have missed out on crucial skill development. Others are coming to the end of their education and will miss out on preparation for work and adult life and higher education and further education. So I think there is a time criticality. I don't think the demographics are going to just be enough to give us a kind of recovery. If that makes sense.
Yeah. And then maybe one final thing to throw into the mix then, I suppose, Emer, you noted in your conclusions, I suppose, the additional supports for particular young people with special education needs or socio-emotional difficulties. So again, is that the type of thing where small group tutoring can provide best, or are there other kind of complementary aspects that should be focused on there? What kind of things do you have, I suppose, have in mind? And likewise, Luke and Kat.
Well, I think it's probably the broader suite of supports, not just learning supports. And to be fair, I didn't give the numbers. That the increase in teaching hours for special schools is quite large compared to the other allocations. But there is also the issue that kind of complementary supports, speech and language, all of those kind of things lost out during the pandemic as well. So, and kind of disruption in routine for those on the autism spectrum and with other needs, again, has impacted. So it's all about that broader kind of suite of supports, education integrated into a broader health and social care perspective. That is going to be challenging. And I think we are facing big challenges around mental health provision in Ireland. We were struggling in waiting lists before the pandemic, but I didn't give you the figures for the 22-year-olds, but you're getting 45% were above the depressive threshold on the CESD measure. And that's quite scary. That's double what it was at 20. So I think that whole piece isn't being spoken about enough in policy terms.
I very, very much agree with that. And coming from a UK perspective, it was quite notable for me seeing in Emer's presentation the mention of longer waiting list on mental health for children and adolescents even before the pandemic, because that's exactly the same problem we've had in England and right across the UK. And there have been a number of recommendations to try and improve mental health support for children and in schools. And it hasn't quite been followed up on yet. And I think that's is a problem across many countries in terms of the nature of the support, in that it's quite focused on, in many cases, on learning loss, which is quite important, but misses some of the problems on mental health, which won't be all young people. And it's important to see that, but for some young people it will be really quite a significant problem, and it's probably almost impossible to try and address learning loss without addressing those barriers to engaging with education in terms of mental health, particularly when it's severe.
Yeah, so there is a danger that many of us will hopefully emerge from this pandemic and will just not want to think about it anymore. But for many people, a large minority, there will be some sort of long shadow from this. And I think rather than burying our heads in the sand about what the pandemic has actually meant for our societies, we need to try to face these challenges head on and indeed allocate so much more money to mental health supports and special educational needs supports and all of that. So we really need to start shouting about this a lot more loudly.
Thanks very much. So we're just coming up to 2:30 now, and so I'm sure to people's afternoon coffee slot now. Thank you very much for joining us during the seminar, and thank you so much to our panelists for giving us, I think, an excellent overview of the research. I know I've certainly taken from this just I suppose that learning loss. There has been huge learning loss during the pandemic. It hasn't been equally shared, and the potential impacts, as Luke very, I suppose, starkly illustrated, are huge. And there really is then like a need for a larger ambition in terms of the policy response and just how important that is, not just on the learning loss, but as we've been talking about the mental health services and associated, I suppose, aspects of this. So I know I certainly have taken that from the session. I hope others have as well. And thank you very much for joining us today on that. We'll be back tomorrow at the DEW from the slightly earlier time of midday to about 1:30, featuring the topic of Will Inflation Make a Return? And that'll feature a keynote address from the Governor of the Central Bank of Ireland. So hope you can join us then for a bit of a different issue or change in tack. But again, thank you very much for joining us today and hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.